When we start Buddhist practice, a lot of us like to have an idea of the path in front of us, some map that we're going to go along, a map that helps illustrate how we can take ourselves out of our ordinary lives and into sort of a more elevated kind of interaction with life and with the world and with everything. So what we're going to do today in this video is to discuss what's called the spiral path. I'll begin by talking about some notions of what has been termed a spiral path in early Buddhism. It's something that I haven't discussed on these videos before. And then my own ideas about a spiral path that can be derived as well. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, the Buddhist teacher Sangharakshita in the last century, a few decades ago, illustrated what he called a spiral path in early Buddhism. Taking from some of the suttas, one sutta in particular that we'll be discussing, a notion of a spiral path that comes out of dependent origination or dependent arising. These are two different ways of translating a term in Pāli, paticca samuppada. Some of us may be familiar with dependent origination. I'll be using these two translations interchangeably, so don't worry if I mix them up. Dependent origination, dependent arising, it's the same thing. This is basically a causal analysis that the Buddha gave of the arising of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness, of suffering in life. How it arose causally out of, well, originally out of ignorance, but then out of a whole number of different steps in between. And Sangharakshita uses that and a later sutta that discusses aspects of that and indeed elaborates upon it in order to come up with this idea that he has of what he calls a spiral path. Now, the idea, dependent origination itself is a bit too complex for me to get into in detail in this video. I've done a previous video on it in general, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the show notes in case you want to know more about dependent origination. However, just to give a very short synopsis of the idea of dependent origination, I'll put up here on the screen the 12 steps in probably what is the most famous, most repeated form of dependent origination in the early texts. It starts in ignorance, as I say, and then basically takes ignorance on to the arising of a body, a human body, we might say, to being embodied, to the arising of sense organs, to those sense organs contacting with things in the world that are around us, to that contact with things in the world producing in us positive and negative feelings, pleasant and unpleasant feelings, to those feelings then conditioning cravings and clingings to things in the world, particularly, let's say, things that we find pleasurable. And then to those clingings and cravings leading to a production of a sense of self, perhaps production of rebirth, depending on how we discuss this, and eventually to birth, to old age and death. And this is, in a nutshell, what dependent origination talks about. It's quite complex. You can see that it's a little bit obscure in some respects. But in any event, it takes us essentially from ignorance to, well, to old age and death in its most repeated description, its most repeated form. But we can also understand that as taking us from ignorance to dukkha, from ignorance to suffering. Now, the description of dependent origination that goes from ignorance to dukkha, to suffering, is really found in very few places. I believe only one, in a sutta called the Upanisa Sutta. And this is, in fact, the sutta that Sangharakshita will take off on to describe this spiral path. Now, if we understand now that there is this description, at least this potential description of the arising of suffering out of ignorance, the question that we're, of course, going to be left with here is, okay, now we have the description of the arising of of suffering. How do we get rid of suffering? How do we get rid of ignorance? How do we get rid of all of this? And there are a number of descriptions in the early texts of getting rid of suffering, but those all involve essentially a negation of each stage along this chain of dependent origination. So they'll say, okay, so we get rid of suffering. How do we get rid of suffering? We get rid of suffering by getting rid of ignorance. Then getting rid of ignorance gets rid of the next stage, which is the arising of volitional formations. And then we get rid of the next stage, which is consciousness, and so on. So in other words, we negate each stage along this chain of dependent origination. Now, this, as I say, this is a repeated kind of negative description of dependent origination, which is supposed to lead us to awakening. However, there are lots of problems with this negative description that I've just given. In particular, first of all, how do we get rid of ignorance? We're starting with perhaps the most difficult stage. Obviously, if we get rid of ignorance, we would be in a much better place. But the question then is, how do we get rid of the ignorance? Another question that we might have is, it's said that if we get rid of ignorance, then that gets rid of volitional formations, which then gets rid of consciousness, which goes on and on. But the question is, if we've already gotten rid of consciousness, what else are we left with? What else in the chain are we left with? It becomes quite obscure how this process of getting rid of each of these stages might actually work in practice, unless we're supposed to understand that all the stages are sort of gotten rid of at once somehow. But again, this is quite obscure. So if we're going to look to the chain of dependent origination to help move us in this sort of spiral way out of our ordinary lives, we're left with a lot of questions. It's not clear how we're supposed to approach this chain of dependent origination in a kind of negative way in order to undo the chain, at least in the early texts. Fortunately, however, there is a second, more positive understanding of how we get out of the chain of dependent origination in the early texts, which we find in the Upanisa Sutta and in a few other suttas. This is a description of, as I say, a sort of an escape, if you like, from the chain of dependent origination. We can think of that original chain as a kind of a syndrome, as a cycle that we, in ordinary life, cycle around and around and around in through many years, decades, if we're following a traditional understanding, through beginningless lifetimes. And this new approach, this more escaping approach, we might say, this approach of getting out of that cycle, is where we're going to focus our efforts, because it shows us a different path, a path of breaking this cycle, a path of instead of being caught in what we might call the worldly or the mundane processes of dependent origination, gets us in a way that transcends those worldly processes. And as a result, following a description in what's called the Netipakarana, which is an early commentarial text, the recent scholar and translator Bhikkhu Bodhi has discussed this same process as transcendental dependent arising. I'd prefer to say transcendent dependent arising. Transcendentalism is sort of a separate thing, and I don't want to confuse it with that. But in any event, I would call it transcendent dependent arising. And Bhikkhu Bodhi has an essay about this very thing, and I'll put a link to that essay down below in the notes in case you're interested. He goes into this in quite some detail, more detail than I'm going to be able to go into on this video. But in any event, he discusses the stages in this transcending of the ordinary cycle of dependent origination. And these transcendent steps are exactly the same steps that that Sangharakshita discusses as the spiral path. This transcendent path then elevates us out of our ordinary life in a series of stages, depending on how we count them, 10 or 11 different stages. And whereas this transcendent path begins in dukkha, begins in this suffering, or it's kicked off by this suffering, we might want to say. And whereas in dependent origination, suffering, if we understand these stages, these 12 steps in the chain of dependent origination as kind of being like a circle, we can think of suffering, that is the last stage of dependent origination, conditioning the first stage, which is ignorance. This is how Bhikkhu Bodhi also describes it in his essay, that sort of suffering conditions ignorance, that it keeps us in this cycle of dependent origination. Or we might also say suffering in some way conditions rebirth or birth or something like that, on a traditional understanding. But whereas if we're caught in this cycle, suffering isn't helpful in this way, it sort of keeps us in the cycle. In order to break out, suffering has to have a different effect. It has to condition something different. It has to do something different to get us out of this cycle. And indeed, in this spiral path, in this transcendent path, suffering conditions faith. And this is perhaps the most surprising step along the path. This very first one, you might say, is the most surprising. It's also potentially the most problematic. People have written about it. Indeed, there's a paper by Jayarava, which I've also linked down below, where he raises a number of, we might call skeptical questions about this, about how it is that suffering is supposed to result in faith arising. We might say if suffering just ordinarily produced faith, if it conditioned faith in us, then all people would be Buddhist in some sense, at least if that's what if we're understanding faith in a Buddhist sense. Now, if we're understanding faith in a Buddhist sense, we should also keep in mind that Buddhist faith is not blind faith. It never really means that in the suttas. It always means some kind of trust or confidence that's based on some reasonable basis. Even a very small reasonable basis, but it has to be something. There's no such really, in Buddhism there really isn't such a thing as completely blind faith. Now I've done a video about that topic as well. I'll leave a link to that as well down in the show notes in case you're interested in hearing more about that. But in any event, we might say that part of the issue here is how it is that we're supposed to have this arising of, let's say, confidence coming out of suffering. Where does that come from? Now, the suttas that we're talking about in this video don't really discuss that. They don't talk about how it is that this confidence, that this trust or faith arises out of suffering. They leave that up in the air. However, there are other suttas in the early tradition that do discuss something that might be relevant, which is they discuss how part of we might say the nutriment of faith, part of what feeds faith, what feeds confidence, is hearing the Dharma, is becoming aware of that Dharma. So we might say that somebody who is mired in suffering, somebody who's mired in a sense of unsatisfactoriness with existence, with life, if they are able to hear the Dharma, if they're able to hear wise teachings, that itself may be the ground in which faith can arise, in which confidence can arise. That is, hearing about this Dharma, hearing about wisdom in some respect, may break them out of the mundane path that they were in, the mundane kind of cycle that they were in, break them out into something more transcendent. And then the other stages follow on faith. That is, the other 9 or 10, depending on how we count these things, follow on that original, that we might say that small glimmer of confidence that there's something else, that there's a different way of proceeding in life. Now, these other stages, I'll list them here on the screen so that you can see them. Again, begins in faith. Then from faith arises joy. From joy arises rapture. From rapture arises tranquility. From tranquility, happiness. From happiness, concentration. From concentration, the knowledge and vision of reality. From that knowledge and vision arises disenchantment, and then dispassion, and then emancipation. And then from emancipation, the knowledge of the destruction of the defilements, which really is simply a knowledge of our emancipation from the defilements. So 10 and 11 are sort of the same thing, except that 11 suggests an awareness of the emancipation that we have gone through. Now, having said all that, how is this really supposed to work in practice? Now, there's too much for me to unpack here. Again, if you want to read more about each step individually, I would suggest, for example, taking a look at Bhikkhu Bodhi's piece that I've linked down below. But in general, what we can say is that this is a process that, again, begins in this kind of faith, which I would term confidence in the first step. And from this faith or confidence arises happiness, arises a sense of joy, because we've seen a different possibility in front of us. This joy and happiness then resolves itself in calm. That is to say, we begin to calm down at least a little bit. We might understand that in our ordinary life, we're generally stressed out, we're generally anything but calm, because we see ourselves in this kind of endless cycle. Now that we've seen a way out of the cycle, we become happier. We become also, as I say, calmer, because there's less to stress about. We begin to see options that weren't there for us before. Then this calm can resolve itself in a kind of ability to reach meditative concentration, meditative depths that we were not able to reach before. These kind of meditative depths then bring clarity to our lives, which we did not have before. So this clarity that we can gain then allows us really to see the way things are for the first time, to begin to see the way things really are, as opposed to being caught always in illusions of one kind or another, which is the way most of us live most of our lives, on sort of an autopilot driven by various illusions of various kinds. Then, having seen the way things really are, that leads us to, as this list says, dispassion and disillusion, if you like. That's one way to put it. That is to say, we become less passionate about things because we begin to see through the attachments that fed those passions. We begin to see through the illusions and so become disillusioned, quite literally. This disillusionment, this dispassion, then resolves itself in freedom, in emancipation is what it says, and eventually in awakening or enlightenment. Now that's, of course, the long goal. We're not anywhere near there yet, but I would submit that if we go through practice for any significant period of time, that is to say months, years, we'll begin to see the way that this process works. And again, it will work slowly, it will not work quickly. So the simile here of a spiral path is one that takes us out of our ordinary daily life, our ordinary worldly life, and into something higher, into something that transcends that overcomes that to some degree. However, I wonder, we've been discussing this as a spiral path because that is the term, the simile that Sangharakshita uses to describe this path that we've been discussing. But I wonder whether spiral is the correct term here, because a spiral is a form, a shape which traverses the same we might say, the same ground again and again, but only at different levels, you see. So it traverses the same ground that we would in a circle, but it passes over it. It transforms itself as it rises. It hits the same places, but at different levels, if you like. And on the description that I've been giving you of this transcendent dependent origination, doesn't really seem to traverse the same ground over and over again. Rather, it seems to break new ground as we're coming out, as we say, of ordinary life. And so I don't know that spiral is quite the right shape to give here. However, what I will say is that the notion of a spiral path is one that has resonated with me ever since hearing about it. And there is actually a different sutta in the early tradition, Majjhima Nikaya 117, known as the Great 40, that describes what I would term a truly spiral path with respect to the Eightfold Path. Now, the Eightfold Path in early Buddhism, and indeed all of Buddhism, is probably the most famous description of the path of practice we have. It leads us from right view to right intention, to right speech, right action, right livelihood, to right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And those 8 stages are supposed to really encompass the path. And when looked at as they ordinarily are, they tend to be looked at as a kind of a line, we might say, if we're talking about shapes, is that they are originally seen as a kind of a line, leading on the one hand from right view to, at the other end of the line, at right concentration. But there are problems with seeing the Eightfold Path as a straight line, because it leads us from, on the one hand, right view at the beginning to something that is going to involve a much deeper understanding of right view at the end. That is to say, we don't begin the Eightfold Path with right view in its most elaborate form, in its deepest form. We begin with a very, very modest sense of right view. So to see the Eightfold Path as a line doesn't seem adequate, in the sense that right view can be seen both as the beginning of the path and in a sense also as the ending of the path. Because in a sense of understanding right view, it is the culmination of the path. The path culminates in wisdom. It doesn't culminate in meditation, it culminates in wisdom. So there's a problem there, which also, if we say it the way I've just said it, suggests that this Eightfold Path might be a kind of circle that begins and ends at the same place. But of course that's not adequate either, because that would suggest we're stuck in the Eightfold Path. We never escape it. There's no way out of it. So then we think of a different kind of shape, a spiral. One that takes us in a way that traverses the stages of the Eightfold Path, but at different levels. So we traverse it once, perhaps, at what we might term a mundane level. And then we rise out of that to traverse it at a different level. And in this early Buddhist text that I mentioned, the Great 40, they discuss just such a process. Now, the Great 40 itself is a text which appears not to be completely original to early Buddhism. That is to say, there are portions of it that are repeated that we find in other recensions of these texts, in Chinese and so on. But there are other portions of it, in particular the portions that are interesting to me here, that seem to be a little bit later. They seem to have been added to the text by a later exegete, a later person who was interested in this material, perhaps from their familiarity with the Abhidharma, which is a later kind of tradition in Buddhism that arose after the Buddha's lifetime. That is to say, that when we traverse this once at the mundane level, then perhaps we might say we traverse it again at a transcendent level. And indeed, in this text, it talks about the mundane Eightfold Path and then the transcendent Eightfold Path. But this material about transcendency and mundaneness, that seems to be later. So what I'm doing here is to take it as an inspiration of a way of looking at this Eightfold Path in a spiral way. And the other thing here is that the transcendent path that's discussed in the Great 40 is itself sort of problematic in various respects. It seems to be the sort of path that's realized all at once, sort of like I was saying about the negative understanding of dependent origination. It seems to be the sort of thing that just happens all at a time. Whereas our practice in the Eightfold Path is going to be one that's gradual, that we may interact with it on the mundane level once, but then we may interact with it, let's say, at a more advanced level again, and again, until perhaps our practice culminates in a transcendency. Now, how do we make sense of all this? And what does it mean to interact with the Eightfold Path on a mundane level as opposed to a more advanced level? This is something that's too big for me to get into here. However, what I've done is to make a course about this, because it's something that is going to take quite a bit of time to unfold. So I have a new course out at the Online Dharma Institute on this kind of rise out of the mundane towards the transcendent over at the Online Dharma Institute. Now, I'll leave a link to that new course below. It's going to be, I hope, of interest to you. It's the sort of course that I think will help to illustrate the path in depth, both at a beginner's level, the way oftentimes we interact with the Eightfold Path, the way most of us really interact with it, but then delving into some of the deeper aspects of that path. In particular, the ways that we can understand the various path factors in ways that are perhaps less obvious, or that involve a deeper or a more dedicated practice, all the way towards an awareness of how the path can be fulfilled even at a transcendent level. My new course is going to be called The Ascent Towards Freedom, the Eightfold Spiral Path. And it is, I think you will see, inspired by the notion of a spiral path from Sangharakshita. It's inspired by the notion of a path that involves aspects at different levels, where we traverse the same material different times, where we rise out of our ordinary mundane life into something more transcendent, into something more liberative, if you like. So I suggest taking a look at that. Again, a link down below. Thanks so much for all of your attention during all these videos. I hope this has been useful to you. I hope I'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.